Welcome to Ink and Insights, where we explore the thinkers and ideas shaping our world today. In this episode, we are joined by Dr. Ayala Panievsky. Dr. Ayala is a researcher specializing in media under attack, right-wing populism, and democratic backsliding. Her research appeared in journals such as the International Journal of Press, Politics, and Digital Journalism, and featured in media outlets like the BBC, the news agents, LBC, and ABC. She is currently a presidential fellow in the journalism department at the City University of London, a research associate at the sociology department at the University of Cambridge, and a research fellow at the Center for the Renewal of Israeli Democracy. As a former journalist, she works with journalists worldwide to improve the future of news in times of sophisticated threats to democracy, equality, freedom, and justice. Her first exceptional book, The New Censorship: How the War on Media is Taking Us Down, published by Footnote Press in 2026, focuses on the unfortunate and unexpected mechanisms through which today's media has inadvertently amplified the anti-democratic movement that looms over our societies. The book was shortlisted for the International Journal of Press, Politics, Hazel Gaudet-Erskine Best Book Award 2026. In today's episode, we'll delve deep into that book and explore the state of media in today's context. Dr. Panievsky, welcome to Ink and Insights with Sumit Sarma Samir.
Thanks so much for having me.
Ayala, what motivated you to write this book and what surprised you most during your research?
So to be honest, I didn't realize that I started writing a book when I started working on this project a decade ago. I got to London to do my master's in Goldsmiths College, and I was curious back then. It was this explosive moment, 2016. Everyone was talking about Donald Trump in the US and Brexit here in the UK. And to me, a lot of this kind of anti-media rhetoric sounded very familiar because I grew up in Israel and we had Benjamin Netanyahu in charge for decades. And he has been on a personal war with the media for a very long time. So a lot of the things that I saw and that felt new to American journalists or to British journalists were very, very familiar. I used to work for Haaretz newspaper back in Israel. I worked for other media outlets. And I felt like there was something there, not just in exploring, the rhetoric, the whole kind of fake news, enemies of the people, attacks on the media, but also what fascinated me most was how journalists and newsrooms were responding to this. Because in my mind, still journalists and newsrooms have quite significant power. Like they have the mic, they have public kind of reputation. They can amplify certain messages. And I couldn't understand why journalists were coping with this rising threat so poorly, actually. So that was my starting point. And it really started as a master's dissertation that then became a PhD dissertation, which I wrote in Cambridge. And then over time, it became a book. But it wasn't the plan.
Okay, right. So could you explain how censorship today differs from traditional state control of media?
Yeah, so I think in previous times, and certainly, what we think of when we think of censorship is this kind of 20th century kind of tactic of either shutting down newsrooms and media organizations, or killing journalists, or throwing them in jail, which, to be sure, still happens in many regions around the world, including the one I'm coming from, right? We know how many journalists were killed in Gaza during this last war. But alongside these kind of old school tactics of censorship, we can see the rise of much more mundane, dominant, more confusing types of censorship. And this is what the book is really about, these new types of censorship that in my research I found were very baffling for journalists and made it much harder to understand. Because when you send out a story and it comes back blackened, or with a big X on it, and people tell you you don't publish it, then
Right.
you know what you're facing, right? And then maybe you have the courage to face it, maybe you don't, but you know what you're in, you know what's happening to you, and what to call it. And what we see now, which is legal threats to journalists, financial threats to newsrooms, public rhetoric that demonizes and incites hatred and violence against journalists. These are not exactly these kind of old school types of censorship. And for many reporters I spoke to, it was much more difficult to get their heads around it and figure out how to handle it.
Right, right. And, in what ways has, mainstream media inadvertently amplified anti-democratic movements?
So I think in many ways, what's unique about the populist movement, and of course there are many movements that are hostile to journalism, right? It's not just this current wave of politicians. But what's unique about the populist anti-media rhetoric is that it's really good at weaponizing journalistic norms against journalists. So taking the very basics of what journalism is supposed to be and how it should serve democracy. And one of the most difficult kind of aspects of it is that populist authoritarians are speaking on behalf of the people, right? They speak,
Right.
they use the terminology of democracy to undermine democracy, because what they do in practice is quite the opposite of democracy, but they keep using the terminology, the language of it, and talking about the people as if only the people who support them are the people, right? And journalists are also wired to serve the people because it's supposed to be a public good, right? Journalism is a good journalism, supposed to serve the people. So there are many core issues in journalism, like objectivity, like balance, like freedom of speech, that are being really skillfully weaponized by populist authoritarians against the media. And you can see it across the board. You can see it happening in many countries. So, for instance, I think one really obvious and simple example is false equivalences. And one of the things that certainly happened in Israel, in the UK, in the US, is that the new censorship is not just about undermining professional journalism and kind of chasing anyone who is being critical or independent. It is also at the same time about establishing this alternative sphere of what I call in the book anti-media media, which is all these media outlets that pretend to do journalism and use the facade of journalism. And, people are sitting with suits in studios, but they are not doing journalistic work. They are not corroborating facts. They are not looking out for stories. They are not scrutinizing the powerful, but they are creating this other universe that then these politicians can say, oh, this is good journalism and this is bad journalism. And you can really see it in action. And at least in my experience, journalists were very slow to figure out what's happening. And they were very slow in saying, oh, these are not my colleagues, actually. They are doing something different. We are not in the same profession. And this is still a struggle that has been going on for a while. I find that many journalists are still not there in grasping this, that this is also part of the new censorship.
Right. Ayala, we understand, how right-wing populism weaponize media narrative that kind of accelerate democratic backsliding. But what does democratic backsliding look like on the ground for ordinary citizens who are consuming news?
I think that's a great question, because I think a lot of the kind of public advocacy and conversations we have about journalism focus on press freedom or free speech, these sort of concepts, and not about us, the public's right to know.
Right.
And I think this is something that I'm trying to do in the book, is really to refocus this whole conversation, because to me, I have many journalists who are my friends, but I don't care about this because of them and what it does to their lives, although the impact can be dramatic, right? People are getting like death threats and having their lives go upside down because of this new war on the media. But I don't care that much about the personal, the individual impact it has on them. My concern and the focus of my research is what it does to us, to the kind of stories that are being told and the kind of stories that are no longer being told, and the kind of people that are invited to newsrooms and those that are not. The ideas, the words, the interviewees that we no longer hear from because of the chilling effect of the war on the media.
Do you see similar patterns of media suppression across different democracies, or are they context specific?
Yeah, so I think what's interesting about this type of about this specific phenomenon is that I see it across the board. By the way, not just in democratic countries. You could also argue that Israel is not necessarily a democratic country, but there is a spectrum, let's say, the democratic spectrum, right? And different countries are on different kind of spots on the spectrum. And I can definitely see the use of the new censorship across the board. But it's true that in countries where you have more prevalent forces of old censorship, you don't need a new censorship that much. But where you have a very prevalent kind of new censorship, then you don't need old censorship that much. One of the things I say in the book is that you don't need journalists to bleed for the news to die. You don't need to kill journalists to make sure the media aligns with the government talking points. You can do it. It's much easier than it used to be, in a way, to intimidate and to change and to transform what journalism look like. And I think there are many issues where you can see not just the same tactics being used. For instance, I can give a few examples, like you see lawsuits, you see slaps, so lawsuits that are intended to intimidate journalists and newsrooms, right? You see the rise of use of lawsuits and libel lawsuits against journalists in many different countries.
Exactly.
And you can see similar legislation efforts to grant this, to create this loyalty regime where the good, loyal media outlets that I call anti-media because they are not really serving us, they are getting all the benefits and all the kind of whatever the government can give them, and everyone else is being undermined and hurt financially and otherwise. So there are many strategies that you can see being used everywhere. But to me, a very interesting point here is that these are sometimes even the very same people. So you see, for instance, now in the US, which is a very influential media sphere because it has impact over what happens everywhere else. You see that David Ellison, the kind of mega billionaires that are now helping Trump and his administration take over the media, these are people who are working with Benjamin Netanyahu as well. So these are, you can literally see, these are, and Sheldon Adelson, who died a few years back, he used to be the greatest donor of both Netanyahu and Trump, and he established the first kind of propaganda newspaper in Israel for Netanyahu years back, and he was very involved in US politics as well. So sometimes it's not just the same tactics, it's sometimes even the same people, the same personnel, the same donors, the same operatives behind the scenes that are working with all these different populist leaders and learning from each other's experiences.
अब धेरै टाइम छैन है बिहे गर्नु छ भने गरिहाल नत्र घरबाट मलाई अन्त्य बिहे गर्दिनु
भर्खर 3 वर्ष भयो एमबीबीएस जोइन गरेको 5 वर्षको कोर्स हो के भो जम्मा छ एक्सक्यूज मी सर मेरो 5 वर्षको कोर्स 3 वर्षमा सकाउन मिल्दैन
गेट आउट
हेलो
के सोच्यो त
के सोच्ने मैले प्रिन्सिपलसँग पनि कुरा गरिसकेँ 3 वर्षमा पनि केही हुन्छ के हुन्छ 3 वर्षमा
के भयो भाइ ल बस साउजी एक कप चिया कसले भन्यो 3 वर्षमा केही हुँदैन भनेर यो हेर एलआइसी नेपालको धनवृष्टि योजनामा 3 वर्षमा पैसा फिर्ता हुन्छ
ए हो र
जीवन बीमाको साथमा धनवृष्टि 3 वर्षमा एलआइसी नेपालको धनवृष्टि योजना एलआइसी नेपाल
There seems to be a very, strong nexus between these group of people kind of supporting each other in terms of both narratives and in terms of both political sort of backups and things like that.
Yeah, and resources. And it's interesting, because this kind of politics is usually very nationalistic and very isolationist, right? It's like America first or Israel first or Hungary first, whatever. And yet they are so good at collaborating across countries and across boundaries in ways that the anti-populist coalition is not always very good at doing. So if you look at the forces that were trying to resist populist authoritarian leaders, I think there is still a lot of work to do there in terms of collaboration and solidarity and learning from each other's mistakes and successes and sharing resources and all of these. This is something that we can actually learn from them, I think.
Right. So in that context, Ayala, who owns truth in our democracy, today's democracy, the media, the people, or no one at all?
So I would say that currently we live in a world where it's very difficult to reach the truth. There is more information than ever, and yet it is more difficult than ever to know what's true. And I think unless we realize that this is the massive fight of our times, and that if we don't fix our information environment, if we don't fix our media, if we don't fix our online jungle of digital fake and fraud, we will not be able to reach the truth anymore. And we will have different ideas, narratives floating around, and we won't have any shared institutions where we can argue about things based on the same facts. So I think currently, yes, truth seems to be getting lost, or at least saved for very specific people who already care about journalism and are willing to pay for news and are getting the best kind of information out there. But for most of us, it has become increasingly difficult, even for media scholars, right? When I open my iPhone, I get all sorts of shit, and you don't always know what's right, right? I mean, and certainly my mom's generation, I mean, it's really difficult. But the answer is nothing that we can do individually. We will have to fix the structure, the system. It cannot be that there is an online jungle where you can do literally anything and get away with it. This is unsustainable. We can't have that. And we can't have a world where anyone who says he's a journalist is a journalist, because then what's the point, right? I mean, now Benjamin Netanyahu's son, Yair, who lives in Miami, for unknown reasons, he started his own podcast, and he now declares himself a journalist. And of course, he very quickly got a press card from the Israeli government. So there is also a question that we have to ask about what kind of journalism is it that we are willing to save, and how to make the distinction between bad faith actors and people who are actually working for us.
Right. Looks like, the populists are also using the same mechanism and tools to propagate their own personal narratives and to establish those truth as perceived by them, right?
Yeah, 100%. And they're also using all sorts of ideas and critical thinking that actually originated from the left, right? Their new kind of, they are using very wisely from their perspective these ideas of constructivism and like each one of us has their own truth, right? Donald Trump and others have been really, really good at saying, oh, yeah, so this is my truth. I mean, you can't tell me that this is my truth, and each one of us has his own truth. So I think we have to kind of snap out of it and realize that this is an urgent issue. And just like each one of us has their own opinions about, global affairs or politics or the economy, we have to have an opinion about the media and how to improve our information environment. And we have to demand that both our journalists and our representatives and the policymakers do something about it. This is very similar to we know now that we need to take care of our planet, right? If you want to keep living on our planet, we need to take care of our media now if we want to keep having any kind of truth in a few years' time.
Right. And I also at times wonder, it may not be generalized across all the societies, but it looks to me that, the far right and the far left, in most of the cases, seems to be sharing similar kind of thought processes and platform in terms of squeezing the space that used to be enjoyed by liberal democracy.
Right. So I think the way I see it, in some countries you have a stronger far left. In most countries, this is not a very powerful political power at the moment. Mm-hmm. And it's true that in the past we've seen in certain regions around the world, and certainly in Latin America, and we've seen a populist left that was also very hostile to journalism, to the media, to kind of criticism, etc. But the current wave that we've seen in various countries around the world is mainly coming from the right, and it has its own distinct kind of characteristics. And while, of course, you have people who are kind of left-wing populists with very kind of anti-liberal politics or rhetoric, I think it's also important not to both side this, and because it's not always true. Most, in many countries today, politics is not symmetrical. And the power of the far right and the power of the far left is very, very you can't even compare them. But it's true that there are terrible political actors everywhere. The question is, will they remain in the margins, and how much we let them dictate what the mainstream looks like and what the public conversation looks like?
Right. So in that context, Ayala, in today's scenario, how can media institutions rebuild trust in societies where populism has eroded it?
So I think what research tells us is that there are several things that they are doing and they shouldn't be doing. So trying to bend over and kind of appease the populist and try to avoid certain guests, certain topics, this is not working. I've talked to so many journalists over the years, and journalists that are really professional and serious and take journalism seriously, and yet they thought that the way to signal to their audience that they are not the lefty traitors that people say they are, was to lean in all sorts of ways further and further to the right. This is not working. This is terrible journalism, but it's also not working because they were hoping it will do exactly what you were asking. They thought it would maintain the public's trust, and they thought it will prevent further media bashing. So it will prevent more attacks by Netanyahu and his people. But actually, over time, what we see is that the kind of media bashing is skyrocketing, actually, and also the public trust in the media is being reduced. So I think there are a few things that journalists can do. One thing is to cover this story properly. All these kind of fights about media regulation and takeover, kind of the capture of the media in different ways, whether it's by friendly billionaires or different legislation or anything like that. This should be covered as a main story. This is not something that is, for nerds who like regulation. It's a big story because without free media, there is no democracy. There is no all our other rights are dependent on the fact that we have a shared reality that we can discuss and argue about, right? So I think one thing is to cover it properly, to make sure people understand what's happening and who is trying to manipulate them and how and why. I think another thing the journalists were really bad at doing so far is working together and showing solidarity. As you said, in different countries, this looks slightly different, but the structure is very much the same. So even if you look at Israel and Palestine, you can see that Jewish journalists in Israel are facing a lot of kind of trouble and difficulties, and they get graffiti sprayed down their homes and they get death threats and everything, but they are still in a much better position than Palestinian journalists in Israel, and who are also in a better position than Palestinian journalists in the West Bank, who are yet in a better position than Palestinian journalists in Gaza. So in each context, you have this hierarchy, and the new censorship doesn't hit everyone equally. And it's the same in different countries. You see in India, for instance, the lives of Muslim journalists are much harder. They are demonized and labeled as enemies more often. In European countries, you see immigrants and women journalists getting much more flack and bashing. So it does kind of vary between contexts, but the structure remains the same, and it's always people from marginalized backgrounds or communities that are getting it worse. And I think there is a lot that journalists and newsrooms can do in this sense, because when you collaborate and when you work together, you actually have a lot of power, and you can really fight back, whether it's against legislation, whether it's against other outrageous actions by these authoritarian leaders. So I think this is another key thing that journalists also globally have to work on fast.
Right. Ayala, do you think there's a time frame for the trend that we are living in? Do you think that the future of democracy and media would be much more optimistic and positive down the line?
I think the optimistic and pessimistic answer for this is that it really depends on us. Like, nothing is inevitable. Even these kind of wise, sophisticated populists, the fact they are using the tools they're using doesn't mean that they should have won so easily necessarily. And it doesn't mean that they will keep winning. We just seen an example in Hungary where people managed to collaborate and work together to kick Orban out. And we are seeing in other there are many different examples of journalists in different countries trying to collaborate and stop the war in the media in specific cases. So, for instance, there is a TV channel in Israel that Netanyahu's billionaire friend was trying to purchase, and all the journalists in this channel came together and fought this, and it didn't happen. And they managed to make sure that he doesn't own this TV channel. And that's everything. But it required everyone to be working in this really hard. It required solidarity and collaboration. And so I think it really depends what we do from now onwards. And perhaps the most hopeful thing I can say is that I feel like we haven't even started fighting back. Like, in many ways, we've been complaining about it for many years now, and it's been a decade since Trump first got elected. But I don't feel like the kind of movement to save our media is anywhere near what it should be right now. So the upside take for this is that we still have a lot to do, and we can definitely win this fight, in my view. So depends on us.
Sure. Ayala, my last question for today's program: how do you sustain hope in difficult times?
I'm not gonna lie, I lose hope a lot. I mean, I come from a difficult place. We've lost many people these past few years from both sides of the border, and it keeps going. Like, no war stopped in the Middle East the past few years. It's really difficult. It's okay to lose hope sometimes, but I think empirically, the world has seen some very dark periods in time. I mean, my family, all my grandparents, like my 4 grandparents, were all Holocaust survivors. They grew up in Poland, and they were all like in the camps and everything, and they survived. So the history is full of very dark times, but and yet you see recovery as well, right? You go to Germany today, it's an okay country. It's fine, like, so I do believe that, yes, hate is very powerful and it's easy to ruin everything and it's harder to build, but empirically, it's very reasonable to believe that things will be better, but it does mean that we will have to work for it. And I think that if we do, we have good chances, actually.
Right. Ayala, so we have to work collectively against hate.
100%.
On that note, I'd really like to thank you for your time. It was lovely talking with you, Ayala.
Thanks so much, Sumit. Happy to be here.